The night was eerily quiet along Virginia's Colonial Parkway, the air heavy with that stillness that makes even the smallest sound echo louder than it should. The wind whispered through the tall trees that lined the narrow stretch of road, and the moon cast its pale reflection on the York River below. It was October 1986, and the fall chill had settled into the bones of the old historic road. The same path that had seen lovers, tourists, and students drive it countless times before without fear. But on this particular night, the quiet beauty of the parkway would become the stage for one of the most haunting mysteries in Virginia's history. Kathy Thomas, 27 years old, was a bright and disciplined former naval officer. She was sharp, independent, and confident, a woman who had learned to stand tall in a world that often tested her resilience. She had recently started a relationship with Rebecca Dowski, a 21-year-old senior at the College of William and Mary. Rebecca was warm and kind-hearted, the type of person who smiled easily and carried a calm presence that balanced Kathy's intensity. The two women had been dating for a few months, and though their relationship was private in a time when being openly gay wasn't easy, they were genuinely happy together. They spent that Friday evening out like any other young couple. Dinner, conversation, and laughter that came effortlessly. Witnesses later recalled seeing them at a local restaurant before driving off toward Williamsburg. Kathy's car, a white 1980 Honda Civic, became a familiar sight to her friends. That night, she steered it toward the parkway, perhaps searching for a quiet place to talk. Colonial Parkway, with its winding roads and scenic overlooks, had long been a known lover's lane, where couples would park under the stars to escape the world for a while. But what neither of them could have known was that someone or something was watching. The next morning, a jogger noticed something unusual on the bank near the York River. The white Honda Civic was parked neatly, facing the water, the windows rolled up and the doors locked. From a distance, it might have looked like someone had stopped to admire the view, but something about the stillness around it felt off. When authorities arrived, that uneasy feeling turned to horror. Inside the car were the bodies of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Both women had been strangled with a length of rope, their throats slit with precision. Diesel fuel had been poured over their bodies in the car, as if the killer had intended to set them on fire, but for some reason hadn't gone through with it. The scene was hauntingly calm, and yet every detail screamed of violence and control. The killer had taken time not only to kill but to arrange things in a particular way. The doors were locked, the keys missing, and there was no sign of a struggle inside. It was as though the two women had been subdued quickly, perhaps by someone they trusted or someone pretending to be trustworthy. There were no gunshots, no screams reported, no sign of robbery. Whoever had done this had been methodical and deliberate. Investigators from the FBI and local authorities descended on the area. They scoured the brush for footprints, tire tracks, anything that could offer a clue. But the Colonial Parkway, beautiful as it was, wasn't kind to evidence. The soft soil, the water's edge, and the cool autumn air had already erased much of what might have been left behind. The few fragments they did find, a length of rope, fibers, and traces of diesel, told them little about the killer but much about his intent. He wanted them silenced. He wanted the scene controlled. He wanted to make sure they were found exactly the way he left them. Word of the murders spread quickly through Williamsburg and the surrounding areas. The community was stunned. The Colonial Parkway was considered one of the safest, most peaceful routes in Virginia, and the idea that such brutality could occur there didn't seem real. Students at William and Mary were shaken to their core. Many of them had driven that same road countless times. Parents began calling their children, begging them not to go out at night, not to drive alone, not to stop on the parkway for any reason. Detectives began digging into Kathy and Rebecca's lives, looking for possible motives. At first, some speculated it could have been a hate crime given the couple's same-sex relationship. But others weren't so sure. The precision of the attack suggested a level of skill, someone who knew what they were doing. Some investigators began to quietly wonder if the killer might have been a member of law enforcement, or someone pretending to be one. The theory emerged after finding no signs of forced entry or resistance. It was possible the women had been pulled over and made to comply with orders. The Colonial Parkway, after all, was frequently patrolled by park rangers and officers who enforced its nighttime restrictions. Autopsies revealed that both women had died by strangulation before their throats were cut. The level of force used was described as intimate by one medical examiner, a disturbing word that implied the killer was close to his victims during the act. Diesel fuel had been poured carefully, almost ritualistically, suggesting the killer wanted to destroy evidence but couldn't bring himself to complete the burning. Whether he panicked, lost his nerve, or was interrupted, no one could tell. The rope used was a type found in marine environments, the kind used by sailors or people familiar with boats, a detail that opened more questions than it answered in a coastal area full of Navy personnel and fishermen. For days, investigators combed through witness statements and vehicle reports. A few people recalled seeing a car parked near the overlook that night, but no one could describe who was inside. Some claimed to have noticed headlights flash behind them on the road, only for the vehicle to disappear when they slowed down. Every lead seemed to fade into mist, and the Colonial Parkway's dense woods kept its secrets. Kathy's family was devastated. Her brother, Bill Thomas, became a quiet but relentless voice in seeking justice for her. He couldn't understand how someone who had served her country, who had done everything right, could meet such an end. Rebecca's parents were equally shattered. They had trusted that their daughter was safe in her college town, far from the dangers of big cities. Now they were faced with the grim task of burying her, haunted by questions no one could answer. The FBI formed a task force to pursue the case, and for months they followed every possible lead. They questioned suspects ranging from ex-lovers to military personnel, to drifters who might have been in the area. Yet nothing stuck. Every path led to a dead end. The killer had left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no clear motive. As autumn turned to winter, the Colonial Parkway murders faded from the headlines, replaced by new stories, new tragedies. But for the families of Kathy and Rebecca, the silence was unbearable. The thought of their loved ones' final moments, the fear, the confusion, the helplessness, haunted them every day. And somewhere in Virginia, a man who had ended 2 lives was walking free, unseen, and unpunished. No one could have known then that this would not be an isolated act of violence. What began with the brutal killing of 2 young women would grow into a string of unsolved murders that would stretch over 3 years and claim multiple couples. The Colonial Parkway, once a symbol of peace and beauty, would soon earn a darker name, the Lover's Lane of Death. And as investigators looked at the chilling precision of the first crime, they began to realize something truly terrifying. Whoever had done this had not finished. The road that connected Virginia's past to its present had awakened a predator, and the shadow of that first double killing would linger over the state for decades to come. The fear that had settled over Virginia after the deaths of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski never truly went away. For a time, people tried to convince themselves that the horror on the Colonial Parkway had been an isolated act of madness, a crime that would never repeat itself. But deep down, the quiet of the Virginia woods had changed. Lovers no longer parked on scenic overlooks, and when headlights appeared behind a car on the parkway, hearts raced with suspicion instead of romance. That fragile illusion of safety shattered again the following year, when another young couple met a fate as mysterious and brutal as the first. It was September 1987, when 20-year-old David Nobling and 14-year-old Robin Edwards went missing. David was a hard-working young man who ran a small business with his brother and had a reputation for being dependable. Robin was a high-spirited teenager who often acted older than her age, known for her confidence and rebellious streak. The two weren't officially dating, but they shared a friendly bond and had spent time together before. On the night of September 19th, they drove out in David's black Ford Ranger pickup truck to talk, perhaps to share a quiet moment away from everyone else. They never came home. The following morning, David's truck was found parked in an isolated area near the Ragged Island Wildlife Refuge, just off the James River Bridge. The driver's door was open, the keys still in the ignition, and the windshield wipers had been left on, swiping rhythmically over a windshield streaked with rain. Inside, investigators found David's wallet and Robin's purse. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away. It was as if the two had stepped out for a moment and vanished into the fog. 3 days later, a fisherman made a grim discovery along the muddy shoreline nearby. 2 bodies lay face down in the reeds, partially clothed and starting to decompose. They were identified as David Knobling and Robin Edwards. Both had been shot in the head with a small caliber weapon, execution style. There were no defensive wounds, no evidence of sexual assault, and no sign of robbery. Once again, 2 lives had been taken with precision, control, and chilling calm. The similarities to the Colonial Parkway murders of the previous year were impossible to ignore. 2 young victims, a couple found in a secluded area near water, murdered with cold efficiency. The police couldn't officially link the cases yet, but the pattern was too striking to dismiss. Both pairs had been last seen together in peaceful moments, and both had been discovered dead without any apparent motive. The killer seemed to strike in places meant for privacy, intimacy, and trust, transforming them into sites of death. Investigators began piecing together David and Robin's last known movements. That night, the two had gone to a drive-in theater with friends before deciding to take a ride. Rain was falling steadily and the roads were slick. Witnesses remembered seeing David's truck parked near the wildlife refuge later that evening, its headlights briefly flashing as if signaling. Some speculated they were pulled over by someone they trusted, maybe a law enforcement officer or someone impersonating one. Others wondered if the killer had followed them from the theater, waiting for the right moment to strike. Detectives found it odd that both doors of the truck were unlocked, and the ignition was still on. It suggested they had left in a hurry or under pressure. Perhaps someone had approached them with authority, flashing a badge or using a spotlight. If so, it would explain why there were no signs of panic, no broken glass, no attempt to flee. They had simply complied, thinking they were safe. But the night had been far from safe. As news of the double homicide broke, fear began to ripple through southeastern Virginia. People started calling the police with every suspicious car sighting, every strange noise on rural roads. Parents warned their teenagers not to drive out late, and couples who once found comfort in the stillness of the parkway now saw it as a place of lurking death. The connection between the 2 double murders was whispered in homes, schools, and cafes. Though the FBI wouldn't confirm it, most locals were convinced a serial killer was on the loose. David's family struggled to understand what had happened. His brother described him as someone who would never willingly put himself in danger, someone cautious and level-headed. Robin's family was devastated beyond words. She had been so young with her whole life ahead of her. Her parents couldn't believe their daughter had ended up in such a brutal crime scene, killed for reasons that made no sense. The tragedy tore through the small community like a storm. As the investigation deepened, detectives tried to uncover any link between the victims of 1986 and 1987. The age gap between David and Robin made the motive harder to pin down. The Colonial Parkway victims were both women and in a romantic relationship, while David and Robin's bond was platonic. Yet the methods, the isolation, the control, the water nearby, the precision of the murders, all pointed toward one individual. The theory that the killer might have been a law enforcement officer grew stronger. People recalled how both scenes showed signs of compliance rather than resistance. suggesting the victims had trusted the person who approached them. The FBI started working closely with local authorities, combing through the background of every officer, park ranger, and military personnel who might have been in the area during both sets of murders. The Colonial Parkway wasn't far from naval bases and training grounds, and many officers used that route regularly. But every suspect that surfaced seemed to lead nowhere. The investigation was further complicated by jurisdictional confusion. The first murders fell under federal jurisdiction since the Colonial Parkway was part of the national park system, but the second occurred just outside federal land. This meant different agencies handled the cases, and crucial communication between departments often broke down. By the time leads were followed up, evidence had been lost to weather, time, and oversight. One of the few physical clues in the 1987 killings was the presence of tiny fibers on the victim's clothing. They didn't match anything from the truck or from the surrounding environment. Forensic experts believed they might have come from the interior of another vehicle, possibly one with carpeting common to law enforcement or government fleet cars. But even that lead went cold. The number of possible vehicles was overwhelming, and without more evidence, there was no way to narrow it down. Meanwhile, the fear grew. Newspapers began running stories that connected the unsolved double murders, calling them the Lover's Lane killings. The name stuck, and suddenly every quiet, wooded road in Virginia carried a sense of unease. Couples drove faster, headlights stayed on longer, and no one dared stop to admire the view. The Colonial Parkway, once a place where people went to find peace, had become a place they avoided at all costs. Months passed, and despite the pressure from the public and the media, the case refused to crack. Detectives revisited the possibility of more than one killer, perhaps a pair of predators working together. But the precision of the murders suggested something else. Planning, patience, and familiarity with law enforcement tactics. Someone who knew how to avoid leaving evidence. Someone who knew how to make victims trust them. The FBI profiler brought onto the case described the killer as likely male, organized and meticulous. He would appear polite and respectable, capable of gaining compliance through charm or authority. The profiler warned that this person wasn't impulsive. He chose his victims carefully, selected locations where escape was impossible, and controlled every detail of the encounter. It wasn't about passion or revenge, it was about power. By the time 1987 came to an end, there were 2 double murders on record with nearly identical hallmarks and no suspects. Families grieved, communities feared, and police patrolled the parkway more than ever before. Yet the killer remained a phantom, unseen but felt everywhere. For a brief moment, Virginia seemed to exhale in uneasy relief. Perhaps people told themselves the nightmare was over, but just months later, when another couple disappeared on that same lonely stretch of road, it became clear that the Colonial Parkway was not finished taking lives. It was as if the road itself had awakened something dark, a presence that fed on trust and quiet moments between lovers. And as the pattern began to unfold in full, investigators realized they were no longer dealing with isolated tragedies. They were chasing a ghost who knew the land, the people, and the perfect places to make them disappear. By the spring of 1988, the Colonial Parkway was no longer a place for peace or quiet reflection. Locals avoided it altogether, and those who had no choice but to drive its long, winding curves did so with their windows rolled up, eyes darting toward every shadow that crossed the road. The beauty of the scenic route had turned into something sinister. Every rustle of the leaves seemed to whisper of the dead. Every patch of fog seemed to hide a ghost. People hoped that the killings of Kathy Thomas, Rebecca Dowski, David Knobling, and Robin Edwards were somehow unconnected. A coincidence, a cruel twist of fate. But deep down, everyone knew better. There was a pattern, a rhythm to the violence, and Virginia was beginning to feel haunted by something it could neither see nor stop. On the night of April 9th, 1988, Two college students, Keith Call and Cassandra Sandy Haley, attended a campus party at Christopher Newport University. Keith was 20 years old, outgoing, friendly, and reliable. Cassandra was also 20, cheerful and bright, the kind of person whose energy filled a room. They were not officially dating, but they had known each other for years and enjoyed spending time together. That night they arrived at the party around 10 and stayed for a few hours, talking and laughing with friends. Keith had promised his parents he'd be home by 1 a.m., and he was the kind of young man who kept his word. When they left the party, they were seen getting into Keith's red Toyota Celica. Friends remembered them joking about taking a short drive before heading home. The night was calm, the air cool and damp, and the road ahead stretched in silence. They never made it home. The next morning, Keith's car was discovered abandoned on the Colonial Parkway, just a few miles from where Kathy and Rebecca had been found 2 years earlier. The driver's door was open, and the keys were still in the ignition. On the front seats, investigators found neatly folded pieces of clothing belonging to both Keith and Cassandra. It looked deliberate, almost staged. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass, and no footprints leading away. The car seemed to have been placed there like a message, but what it meant was anyone's guess. The immediate search for Keith and Cassandra became one of the largest in the area's history. Dozens of volunteers, police officers, and even Navy divers scoured the riverbanks, the woods, and every path along the parkway. Helicopters hovered overhead, their lights cutting through the trees as families and friends waited in silent hope. But as days turned into weeks, no bodies were found. It was as if the two had simply vanished into thin air. Investigators were baffled. The car's condition suggested the pair had not been attacked there. The folded clothing raised disturbing questions. Had they been forced to undress at gunpoint? Had the killer taken them elsewhere? Or had someone they trusted convinced them to leave willingly? The FBI, now fully engaged in what was clearly a developing series of connected murders, began to suspect the same predator had struck again. The similarities were undeniable. A young couple isolated in a remote area near water, their car left behind and no witnesses. The killer's confidence seemed to be growing. He had learned from each crime, refining his methods, removing traces, controlling every variable. What terrified investigators most was that this time, there were no bodies. No physical proof of murder, only the chilling absence of life. Families clung to the faint hope that Keith and Cassandra might still be alive. Some believed they had run away. Others feared they were being held somewhere. But those hopes dimmed quickly. There had been no activity on their bank accounts, no calls to friends or family, no sign they had left voluntarily. The FBI began to treat it as a homicide even without bodies. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some said the killer was a police officer who pulled couples over using flashing lights, a theory that explained the victim's compliance. Others whispered that it was someone with military training, given the methodical nature of the crimes and the proximity to naval bases. A few believed it was two killers working together, one using charm to gain trust and the other delivering death. As the investigation deepened, the FBI interviewed dozens of people who had been on the parkway that night. A handful reported seeing a red car matching Keith's driving toward the river between midnight and 1 a.m. Another witness claimed to have seen an unmarked police car nearby around the same time. None of it led anywhere. Every thread unraveled just as quickly as it appeared. Keith's family refused to give up. His mother appeared on local television, pleading for information, her voice cracking under the weight of uncertainty. Cassandra's parents attended every search, walking the muddy paths themselves, calling their daughter's name into the dense woods. The community rallied around them, organizing vigils and distributing flyers with the missing couple's faces. But as time passed, hope began to wither. Months later, when summer arrived, the Colonial Parkway once again fell into uneasy silence. The FBI quietly admitted that the chances of finding Keith and Cassandra alive were almost non-existent. But without bodies, there could be no closure. No autopsy, no answers. Their disappearance deepened the mystery that was already consuming Virginia. The killer's confidence was terrifying. He seemed to be playing a game, appearing, killing, vanishing, and leaving nothing behind but fear. Theories began to multiply. One FBI profiler suggested the killer might be someone who had once been rejected or humiliated by a woman, and now sought power through domination and control. Others thought he was targeting couples deliberately to destroy intimacy, to erase love where it existed. But no matter the theory, the pattern was undeniable. The killer seemed to strike once a year, in the same region, always choosing pairs who represented youth and trust. He wasn't just taking lives. He was sending a message. The case began to attract national attention. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the Colonial Parkway killer. Television crews arrived to film the hauntingly beautiful road that had become synonymous with horror. Residents complained about being portrayed as living in a town of fear, but deep down they knew the reputation was deserved. The Parkway, once a symbol of Virginia's history, was now cursed by its present. In 1989, a year after Keith and Cassandra vanished, another discovery would send shockwaves through the state and confirm what many feared. The Colonial Parkway murders were far from over. But before that final act unfolded, the families of the missing couple continued to search for answers. Keith's parents kept his room exactly as it was, refusing to change anything in the hope that one day he might return. Cassandra's friends would drive the Parkway late at night, leaving flowers where the car had been found, whispering her name into the wind. The absence of bodies created an even deeper kind of terror. At least with the previous victims there had been closure, however painful. But with Keith and Cassandra there was only silence. A silence that felt heavier than death itself. Each passing month brought new theories, new suspects, and new dead ends. Even within the FBI task force, frustration was palpable. Agents disagreed over whether the cases were connected, and resources were stretched thin. By late 1988, investigators began quietly referring to the killer as the Ghost of the Parkway. It wasn't an official name, but it fit. He struck suddenly, left no trace, and disappeared back into the mist. The psychological profile described him as intelligent, disciplined, and familiar with law enforcement techniques. He likely lived nearby, possibly even someone who had helped search for the victims. That thought chilled everyone involved. What no one could deny was the eerie precision in the pattern. 4 double killings or disappearances, all within roughly 30 miles of each other, all involving couples, all in secluded areas near water. The odds of coincidence were non-existent. This was one person or one pair moving deliberately, killing with purpose. The Colonial Parkway was closed periodically for safety reasons, but that did little to ease the public's anxiety. Each year as autumn approached, the same season when the first murders occurred, residents braced themselves for more bad news. The killer's rhythm had almost become a part of the landscape, like the changing leaves or the fog that clung to the river at dawn. For Keith and Cassandra's families, the waiting never ended. They lived in limbo, caught between hope and grief. Every phone call, every knock at the door sent a jolt of fear and desperate anticipation through them. And even as the world moved on, they remained trapped in that single night in April 1988, wondering where their children had gone, and what horror had found them in the dark. The Colonial Parkway murders were no longer just crimes. They were an open wound in Virginia's history, a story of love and terror that refused to fade. And though no one knew it yet, the following year would bring the discovery that would cement the killer's legend forever, ensuring that his shadow would stretch across the Parkway long after the last victim was found. By the fall of 1989, the Colonial Parkway had become a name spoken only in hushed tones. The once scenic route connecting Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown had turned into a symbol of death and dread. It had been 3 years since the first bodies were found. 3 years of unanswered questions, broken families, and whispers of a phantom killer haunting Virginia's most peaceful road. The community was exhausted from fear, yet just as the terror seemed to fade, the nightmare returned one last time. Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps had known each other for years. Daniel was 21, easygoing and kind, someone who rarely found himself in trouble. Anna Maria was 18, bright and full of promise, a young woman who smiled easily and had plans for her future. They weren't a couple, but were close friends, connected through Daniel's brother Clint, who was dating Anna Maria. On the evening of September 4th, 1989, Labor Day weekend, Daniel offered to drive Anna Maria from Virginia Beach to Amelia County, where she planned to meet up with Clint and attend a family gathering. It was a drive of only a few hours. Neither of them would ever make it. When they didn't arrive, their families immediately knew something was wrong. Daniel was responsible and would never vanish without word, and Anna Maria wasn't the type to disappear. The next day, police located Daniel's car, a beige Chevrolet Nova, abandoned at an Interstate 64 rest stop near New Kent County, less than a mile from the Colonial Parkway. Inside the car were their personal belongings, untouched. The keys were still in the ignition, and the doors were locked. It looked eerily similar to the earlier cases. No signs of struggle, no robbery, just a sudden quiet vanishing. For 6 long weeks there was nothing. No clues, no bodies, no leads. Search teams combed through the surrounding woods and marshland, but the dense trees and tangled underbrush swallowed everything. Families held vigils, newspapers ran daily stories, and fear crept back into every Virginia home. Many people already suspected that the Colonial Parkway killer had struck again, and as much as authorities tried to calm the public, they knew in their hearts that this disappearance carried the same chilling signature. Then in late October, a group of hunters stumbled upon something deep in the woods off Interstate 64, not far from where Daniel's car had been found. They noticed a patch of earth disturbed, half hidden by fallen leaves and roots. When police arrived and began digging, they uncovered 2 skeletons lying side by side, their bones intertwined as if they had fallen together. The remains were later identified as Daniel Lauer and Anna Maria Phelps. The scene was grisly. The skeletal remains showed signs of stabbing or slashing, and the bones suggested the pair had been killed elsewhere before being placed in the woods. Their bodies had been there for weeks, maybe longer, left to the mercy of insects and weather. The killer had made no attempt to hide them well. It was as if he wanted them to be found eventually, as part of his macabre ritual. The placement, the calmness of the staging, the proximity to a major road and water, it all pointed to the same calculated hand that had orchestrated the previous killings. By now, the FBI had no doubt that they were dealing with one of the most elusive and methodical serial killers in American history. The Colonial Parkway Murders, as they were now officially called, spanned 4 known crime scenes, 8 victims, and 3 years of escalating precision. Couples, lovers, friends, it didn't matter. The killer seemed drawn to pairs, to the trust that existed between 2 people alone in the dark. He had turned Virginia's romantic back roads into his hunting ground. For investigators, the pressure was immense. The FBI task force, operating out of Norfolk, poured through hundreds of leads. They re-interviewed witnesses from previous cases, tested fibers, and revisited evidence that had been stored for years. They looked for links between the victims, military connections, schools, workplaces, but there was no overlap. The only constant was geography and the killer's haunting familiarity with the area. He knew where to strike, where to dump bodies, and how to vanish without a trace. Some agents became convinced the killer was a law enforcement officer or former military member. The way the victims' vehicles were always found, locked, orderly, sometimes with keys still inside, suggested authority and control. The victims appeared to have trusted the person they encountered, complying with his instructions. The Colonial Parkway itself was under federal jurisdiction, regularly patrolled by rangers and naval police. It wasn't hard to imagine a predator exploiting that trust, using flashing lights or a badge to lure his victims into a false sense of safety before turning deadly. Others thought it might be a civilian with a deep knowledge of law enforcement methods, someone who studied police procedures and enjoyed outsmarting them. The killer's understanding of evidence, his ability to erase traces and leave behind confusing clues, suggested intelligence and patience. This was not someone who acted impulsively. This was someone who hunted deliberately. Despite exhaustive efforts, every lead dried up. The FBI compared the Colonial Parkway murders to other unsolved cases across the East Coast, hoping to find a connection. There were similarities to some killings in North Carolina and Maryland, but nothing conclusive. Forensic technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to extract DNA from the degraded evidence, and many of the samples collected were too contaminated to yield results. Meanwhile, the families of the victims suffered in silence. The parents of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski still waited for justice. David Nobling's father kept in touch with Robin Edwards' family, bound together by the same grief. Keith Call and Cassandra Haley's parents, still without their children's bodies, lived in a limbo that no one could imagine. And now the Lowers and the Phelps families joined that circle of pain. 8 young lives full of promise gone without explanation. In the years that followed, the Colonial Parkway murders would become one of America's most chilling unsolved cases. The media speculated endlessly. Some journalists believed there was more than one killer, perhaps a pair of predators working together, each feeding the other's sickness. Others suggested the killer might have died, moved away, or been imprisoned for another crime. But the most disturbing theory of all was that he was still alive, still out there watching from the shadows. Time passed, but the story never truly faded. The parkway itself became an eerie memorial to the dead. Travelers reported strange sensations while driving at night, headlights appearing in rearview mirrors and vanishing suddenly. Faint whispers carried on the wind, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Locals avoided it after dark, and even the bravest souls felt their stomach tighten when their tires touched its curves. As technology advanced, the FBI reopened the case several times. In the early 2000s, new DNA testing methods were applied to old evidence, including rope fibers and hair found near one of the cars. For a brief moment, hope surged that the killer's identity might finally be uncovered, but the results were inconclusive. The samples were too degraded, too mixed with environmental contamination. Still, the investigation never fully closed. Every few years, new forensic tools would bring renewed attention, and families would hold their breath again. Bill Thomas, the brother of Kathy Thomas, became one of the most outspoken advocates for the victims. He dedicated his life to keeping the case alive, pushing for transparency, new testing, and justice for all 8 souls who had died. His persistence helped maintain public interest and eventually led to the re-examination of long-forgotten evidence boxes. Even decades later, he continued to believe that someone, somewhere, knew the truth. Today, the Colonial Parkway is still breathtaking in daylight, lush, green, and peaceful. But once the sun dips below the horizon, it becomes something else entirely. Drivers describe how the darkness there feels heavier than anywhere else, how the road seems to swallow sound, how the trees lean in as if they remember, the air feels colder, and the weight of the unsolved murders lingers like a whisper from the past. The case remains open, the killer's identity a secret carried by time and silence. Some believe he is dead, buried somewhere far from the scenes of his crimes. Others think he walks among the living, older now, ordinary, blending into society as if nothing ever happened. But for those who know the story, who have studied the evidence and walked the same paths the victims once did, the fear never truly leaves. The Colonial Parkway was meant to celebrate history, to connect Virginia's beginnings to its present. But for many, it has become a monument to something darker. A reminder that even the most beautiful places can hide unspeakable horrors. As the years pass and the road grows quieter, the truth remains buried somewhere along those twisting miles. Perhaps one day new technology or a long-kept confession will finally expose the person responsible. Until then, the shadows on the parkway keep their secrets, and the ghosts of 8 young lives still drift through the mist, waiting for justice that may never come.